saw a man standing on the corner of Gowan Avenue, just very, very agitated. And the one thing that I couldn't help but keep looking at was like the glasses he had on his face. They didn't seem to fit.
Okay, so around 11:29, a man was seen acting anxious on the corner of Monster Road and Gowan Avenue. Jill Dando drove in this way. She drove up Gowan Avenue towards her front door. He followed her up the street. He ambushed her at her door. He shot her once in the head, then he ran off.
I heard a scream. I looked out the window and saw a character walk away. And also saw a chap coming out of number 30.
I came out of the front door and I saw this man running down the street, and he immediately alerted my attention because he was furtive. He was up to no good. I could tell it at once.
So when Barry George's name is brought up, naturally people will say it couldn't have been Barry George. He didn't have the mental capabilities or the IQ to stand on a street corner, wait for Jill Dando to turn up, shoot her, then run away. Barry George didn't have the mental capabilities or the IQ to carry out such a task. So to me this sounds ludicrous. To dismiss a suspect from a murder investigation because their IQ is said to be too low makes no sense to me. If Barry George didn't kill Jill Dando, it wasn't because his IQ was too low. Whoever shot Jill Dando was not a criminal mastermind. This murder was not as sophisticated as people like to think it is. So the yellow line represents the direction Jill Dando was driving from down Munster Road. A man was seen on the corner of Munster Road and Gowan Avenue at 11:29. He followed Jill Dando up the street, shot her on the doorstep and ran off. I don't understand why Barry George was not, in theory, capable of doing this. In 1983, Barry George was arrested in the grounds of Diana's home at Kensington Palace. It emerged after the trial. He was armed with 2 knives and a 15-foot coil rope and wearing combat gear and a SAS mask. It says that the same year as his arrest, he had been stopped 4 times in 10 months hanging around the grounds of Kensington Palace in the middle of the night. Police later found pictures and articles about the princess in his flat and details of her registration number. What was Barry George doing on the grounds of Kensington Palace with essentially a murder kit? What was he doing there? Did he get an obsession with Princess Diana through the media, and due to his mental vulnerabilities, this obsession almost become deadly? And is this exactly the same thing that we're seeing with Jill Dando? He got an obsession with her through the media, and obsession became deadly. Both Jill Dando and Princess Diana, their profiles are exactly the same. They're both British golden girls. They're both like the girl next door type. They even look the same. This is the exact type of personality of a woman that would attract a stalker.
We now live in a society where there are a significant proportion of our fellow citizens who live very lonely, isolated lives, but at the same time they're bombarded with images of other people's intimacy. So a lonely, sad individual sitting in their one-room flat can watch large numbers of desirable people apparently talking to them, and it feeds their fantasies. And as long as there are celebrities offering a pseudo-intimacy virtually 24 hours a day through television and radio, there are bound to be stalkers. Clearly, if the person is severely mentally disordered and increasingly intrusive, this is worrying. If the person's a substance abuser and becomes threatening, if the person has already got a history of violence, all of these things increase the risk. Violence is imminent in stalking because the stalker is inevitably frustrated. The stalker inevitably is brought up against the limitations of reality. and that can produce anger, and anger can lead to threats and to violence. A significant proportion of those who stalk are mentally disordered, and some of them are frankly mentally ill. The fact that they finish up stalking reflects a failure very often of adequate treatment and of adequate support and care in the community. If these people received the level of care and treatment that they need, they might not finish up plaguing their unfortunate victims. Stalkers are largely concerned with gaining a relationship or pursuing a relationship they mistakenly believe exists. Who's a fan moves over to becoming not just intensely preoccupied with someone, but actually believing there's a real relationship. What that shift is usually about is things in that individual's own life. They're usually socially isolated individuals. Their life is offering no real satisfactions, and suddenly there is a way out. It is terrifying to have someone follow you, stand outside of your house, watch you wherever you go, phone you repeatedly, write constantly. Just the stalking itself can reduce people to a state of desperation. It wrecks their lives. They give up work, they move house, they curtail their social activities, and in some cases they become depressed and severely anxious.
There were reels and reels of undeveloped film, which gave up pictures of 419 different women. George had a habit on his wanderings around southwest London of suddenly appearing in front of a woman's face to take a photograph. After his arrest, dozens of women came forward to reveal how they'd been watched and followed by George. He had pestered some for years and left threatening notes when angry at being rebuffed.
Perhaps he was worried by his own past. Claire Dawson was one of a number of women who said in court they had been stalked by him.
It was about, I'd say, 2 months, and it involved him just following me home and turning up at my work. You know, he wasn't particularly close, but far enough behind that I suddenly, after a while thought, this guy's following me on a regular basis.
What might drive a stalker to kill?
The difference between ordinary stalking, which is just being a nuisance, and killing is very difficult to know. The only thing that really comes to mind is that that person has such a store of uncontrollable and uncontrolled aggression that given certain circumstances, it might come out in terms of murder. Jill Dando, I think one of the quite likely things is the fact that she's got engaged, because what happens with many of these stalkers is that they develop a delusional idea, that's a false idea, that the celebrity is actually in love with them. Now, if that person then announces they're going to get married to somebody else, that's infidelity, and that could then lead to the upsurge of anger, violence, and fortunately only in a few cases, but murder.
My guess would be it's some kind of stalker, or somebody's had a fixation on this poor woman and done this awful thing to her.
Public figures inhabit our worlds, and you never know quite what imaginings are laid on to people who are in our living rooms day in, day out on television. And that can add to the complexity. And this is where you have this problem that I think was a particular problem for the police in this particular case, is that although the individual apparently was a stranger to her assailant, in some ways she was somebody her assailant knew very well. And that relationship issue is part of the things that it's so difficult to disentangle.